Chapter 1. Historical Context. The story of 1 and 2 Maccabees begins long ago, around 175 BC, during the time of the Seleucid Empire. This empire was one of the many kingdoms that arose after the death of Alexander the Great. At the time, the king was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He wanted to spread Greek culture and force everyone in his kingdom to follow the same customs. Antiochus believed that his way of life was better than anyone else's, and he wanted everyone to abandon their own traditions. The Jewish people lived in the land of Israel, and they followed the laws of God that had been passed down to them through Moses. They worshipped only one God and followed his commandments. But Antiochus did not care about their beliefs. He wanted the Jewish people to forget their God and follow the Greek ways instead. Antiochus and the Desecration of the Temple. Antiochus sent his soldiers to Jerusalem, the holy city of the Jews, and did terrible things to their most sacred place, the temple. The Bible tells us in 1 Maccabees 1:21-22, and entered proudly into the sanctuary, and took away the golden altar, and the candlestick of light, and all the vessels thereof, and the table of the showbread, and the pouring vessels, and the vials, and the censers of gold, and the veil, and the crowns, and the golden ornaments that were before the temple, all which he pulled off. Antiochus stole the treasures of the temple and defiled it. He ordered that a statue of a Greek god, Zeus, be placed inside the temple. He also commanded that pigs, which were considered unclean animals by Jewish law, be sacrificed on the altar. This act of desecration was an insult to God and deeply hurt the Jewish people. The laws against the Jewish faith. Antiochus did not stop there. He made laws that forbade the Jewish people from practicing their faith. In 1 Maccabees 1:41-43, it says, "Moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom, that all should be one people, and every one should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Many also of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed unto idols, and profaned the Sabbath. The king demanded that everyone in his kingdom worship the Greek gods and follow Greek customs. He banned the study of the Torah, the holy book of the Jews, and forbade circumcision, a sacred practice for Jewish families. Anyone caught following these laws was punished severely, even put to death. The persecution of the faithful. Some Jews gave in to the pressure and abandoned their faith to follow the king's orders. But many others remained faithful to God, even though it meant risking their lives. The Bible tells us about the terrible punishments they faced. In 1 Maccabees 1:60-61, it says, "At which time, according to the commandment, they put to death certain women that had caused their children to be circumcised. And they hanged the infants about their necks, and rifled their houses, and slew them that had circumcised them. Families were torn apart, and many people died because they refused to break God's commandments. Despite the cruelty, there were those who stood firm in their faith. They trusted that God would see their suffering and help them in their time of need." The spirit of resistance. Even though things seemed hopeless, a spirit of resistance began to grow among the Jewish people. They remembered the stories of their ancestors, how God had saved them from Pharaoh in Egypt and brought them into the Promised Land. They believed that God would deliver them again if they stayed faithful. This time of persecution set the stage for the Maccabean revolt, which would begin with the actions of a single family that refused to bow to Antiochus' orders. Their courage would spark a movement that would change history. Lessons from Chapter 1. Chapter 1 of 1 Maccabees reminds us of the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult. The Jewish people faced terrible challenges, but many of them refused to give up their faith. They chose to trust in God, even when it meant facing persecution. This chapter also shows us the dangers of pride and tyranny. Antiochus thought he could force everyone to follow his way of life, but his actions led to suffering and resistance. It is a reminder that leaders should respect the beliefs and traditions of others. The events of Chapter 1 are sad and painful, but they also show the strength of faith. The Jewish people's love for God and their determination to follow his commandments would not be destroyed, even by the might of an empire. This chapter sets the stage for the incredible story of courage and hope that follows in the books of 1 and 2 Maccabees. Chapter 2. The Spark of Rebellion. After Antiochus IV Epiphanes passed laws that forbade the Jewish people from practicing their faith, many were left feeling hopeless and afraid. But not everyone gave up. A man named Maccabees, a priest from the town of Modian, stood up against the king's orders and refused to bow down to false gods. Maccabees' defiance. Maccabees was a faithful man who loved God and followed his commandments. When Antiochus' officers came to Modian, they tried to force the people to offer sacrifices to the Greek gods. They wanted Maccabees, as a leader, to set an example by obeying their command. But Maccabees refused. In 1 Maccabees 2:19-20, he boldly declared, "Though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him, and fall away every one from the religion of their fathers, and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons and my brethren walk in the covenant of our fathers." Maccabees knew that obeying God was more important than following the king's orders. He refused to betray his faith, even though it put his life in danger. The first act of rebellion. As Maccabees stood firm, another man stepped forward to offer a sacrifice to the Greek gods. This man was willing to abandon God's law to save himself. Maccabees could not allow this to happen. Filled with righteous anger, he acted quickly. In 1 Maccabees 2:24, it says, "Wherefore when Maccabees saw it, he was inflamed with zeal, and his reins trembled, neither could he forbear to shew his anger according to judgment. Wherefore he ran, and slew him upon the altar." Maccabees also struck down the king's officer, who was forcing the people to sacrifice. He destroyed the altar and called out to the crowd, urging them to stand with him and fight for God's law. This moment marked the beginning of the Maccabean revolt. Fleeing to the mountains. After this bold act, Maccabees and his sons knew they could not stay in Modian. They would be hunted by the king's forces. So, they fled to the mountains, leaving behind their home and possessions. They were joined by others who were faithful to God and refused to obey Antiochus' laws. Together, they formed a group of rebels, determined to fight for their faith. In 1 Maccabees 2:28, Maccabees said, "Whosoever is zealous of the law and maintaineth the covenant, let him follow me." These words inspired many to leave everything behind and join the cause. The zeal of the faithful. The rebels faced many challenges. They had to live in the wilderness, far from the comforts of home. But they trusted in God and remained committed to their mission. They knew they were fighting for something greater than themselves, the freedom to worship God and keep His commandments. However, not all went smoothly. The Bible tells us about a tragic event where some faithful Jews, who refused to fight on the Sabbath, were attacked and killed by the king's forces. In 1 Maccabees 2:38, it says, "So they rose up against them in battle on the Sabbath, and they slew them, with their wives and children and their cattle, to the number of 1,000 people." This loss was devastating, but it taught the rebels an important lesson. They needed to defend themselves, even on the Sabbath, to protect God's law. Maccabees' final words. As the rebellion grew, Maccabees became older and weaker. He knew his time on earth was coming to an end, so he gathered his sons and gave them words of encouragement. He reminded them of the great heroes of their faith, like Abraham, Joseph, and David, who trusted in God and were rewarded for their righteousness. In 1 Maccabees 2:50, Maccabees said, "Now therefore, my sons, be ye zealous for the law, and give your lives for the covenant of your fathers." He urged them to remain brave and trust in God's power to deliver them. Judas Maccabeus takes the lead. After Maccabeus' death, leadership of the rebellion passed to his son, Judas, who became known as Judas Maccabeus. The name Maccabeus means hammer, a fitting title for someone who would lead the fight against the mighty Seleucid Empire. Judas was a skilled warrior and a man of great faith. He inspired the rebels to stand strong, no matter how great the odds. Lessons from Chapter 2. Chapter 2 of 1 Maccabees teaches us about courage and the importance of standing up for what is right. Mattathias and his family refused to abandon their faith, even when it meant risking everything. Their bravery inspired others to join the fight for freedom. This chapter also reminds us that faith in God can give us the strength to face even the most difficult challenges. Mattathias and his followers trusted in God's plan, and their actions set the stage for a great victory. Closing thoughts. The story of Mattathias and the start of the Maccabean revolt shows us that one person's faith and courage can make a difference. Even in the face of oppression, Mattathias chose to obey God rather than men. His example reminds us to stay true to our beliefs and trust in God's power to deliver us, no matter how hard things may seem. Chapter 3. The leadership of Judas Maccabeus. After the death of Mattathias, his son Judas Maccabeus took charge of the rebellion. Judas was a strong leader, known for his courage and faith in God. He inspired the people to stand up against the mighty Seleucid army, even though they were outnumbered and outmatched. Judas knew that their strength came from God, not from the size of their army. Preparing for battle, Judas began to gather an army of faithful men who were willing to fight for God's law and their freedom. In 1 Maccabees 3:18-19, Judas reminded his soldiers, "Howbeit the Lord himself is stronger than them both. Therefore, let us not fear them." He told them to trust in God and not to be afraid of the enemy's power. Judas and his men trained hard and prepared for battle. They prayed together, asking God to guide them and give them victory. Judas often reminded his soldiers of how God had saved their ancestors in the past, like when David defeated Goliath or when Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. These stories gave them hope and strength. The first victory. One of Judas' first major battles was against a Seleucid general named Apollonius. Apollonius led a large army to crush the rebellion, but Judas and his men were ready. The Bible tells us in 1 Maccabees 3:22, "Wherefore the Lord himself will overthrow them before our face. And as for you, be ye not afraid of them." Judas led his men into battle with great faith and courage. Even though the enemy was strong, Judas' army fought bravely and defeated Apollonius. They took Apollonius' sword, and Judas used it in future battles as a symbol of God's power and their victory. The Battle of Sarin. After Apollonius was defeated, another Seleucid general named Sarin tried to stop Judas. Sarin brought a larger army, hoping to intimidate Judas and his men. But Judas reminded his soldiers that their strength came from God. In 1 Maccabees 3:23, he said, "It is not a hard matter for many to be shut up in the hands of a few, and with the God of heaven it is all one, to deliver with a great multitude or a small company." Judas' army faced Sarin's forces and once again came out victorious. This battle showed that their trust in God was not misplaced. The people began to see Judas as a true leader, chosen by God to deliver them from their enemies. Cleansing the land. With these victories, Judas and his army began to drive out the Seleucid forces from their land. They destroyed idols and altars that had been set up to worship Greek gods, and they restored the Jewish way of life in the towns they freed. Judas was not only fighting for political freedom, but also for the right to worship God and follow his commandments. Facing the mighty Nicanor, the Seleucid king, angered by Judas' success, sent a powerful general named Nicanor to crush the rebellion once and for all. Nicanor's army was huge, with thousands of soldiers and war elephants. Many people thought Judas and his men had no chance against such a mighty force. But Judas did not lose faith. He gathered his men and prayed to God for help. In 1 Maccabees 4:10, Judas prayed, "Now therefore, O Lord of heaven, send a good angel before us for a fear and dread unto them." Judas trusted that God would fight for them, just as he had fought for their ancestors. When the battle began, Judas and his army fought bravely. They used their knowledge of the land and their faith in God to overcome the odds. Against all expectations, Judas and his men defeated Nicanor's army. This victory showed everyone that God was with them and gave them hope for the future. Lessons from Chapter 3. Chapter 3 of 1 Maccabees teaches us that faith in God can give us the strength to overcome even the greatest challenges. Judas Maccabeus and his men were not the strongest or the largest army, but they trusted in God, and he gave them victory. This chapter also reminds us that true leadership comes from courage and faith. Judas inspired his people to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. His bravery and trust in God made him a hero and a symbol of hope for his people. Closing thoughts. The story of Judas Maccabeus shows us that with God's help, we can face any challenge. Judas' faith and courage brought freedom and hope to his people, and his story continues to inspire us today. Chapter 3 reminds us to trust in God and to stand up for what we believe, no matter how hard it may seem. Chapter 4. The rededication of the temple. After the many victories of Judas Maccabeus and his army, the Jewish people finally had hope again. They had fought hard to reclaim their land, but one task remained unfinished: restoring the temple in Jerusalem. The temple was the most sacred place for the Jews, but it had been desecrated by Antiochus IV Epiphanes and his soldiers. Now it was time to make it holy again. Reclaiming the temple. Judas and his men entered Jerusalem and went to the temple. What they found broke their hearts. The altar had been defiled, and the entire place was in ruins. In 1 Maccabees 4:38 it says, "And when they saw the sanctuary desolate, and the altar profaned, and the gates burned up, and shrubs growing in the courts as in a forest, or in one of the mountains, and the priest's chambers pulled down, they mourned deeply. The people tore their clothes, wept, and prayed to God for guidance." They knew that restoring the temple would not be an easy task, but they were determined to honor God and make the temple a place of worship once again. Cleansing the temple. The first step was to cleanse the temple and remove all traces of the pagan idols and sacrifices. Judas ordered his men to tear down the old, defiled altar. In 1 Maccabees 4:44-45 it says, "And when as they consulted what to do with the altar of burnt offerings, which was profaned, they thought it best to pull it down, lest it should be a reproach to them. They carefully took apart the altar and placed the stones in a separate area, planning to deal with them later. Then they built a new altar, following the instructions given in the law of Moses. They made sure that everything was done according to God's commandments." Rededicating the temple. After the temple was cleansed, Judas and his men rededicated it to God. They built a new altar and brought in new holy vessels. They also made a new menorah, or candlestick, to replace the one that had been stolen. On the 25th day of the month of Kislev, they held a great celebration to rededicate the temple. In 1 Maccabees 4:56-58 it says, "And so they kept the dedication of the altar 8 days, and offered burnt offerings with gladness, and sacrificed the sacrifice of deliverance and praise. They decked also the forefront of the temple with crowns of gold and with shields, and the gates and the chambers they renewed, and hanged doors upon them. Thus was there very great gladness among the people, for that the reproach of the heathen was put away." This celebration became known as the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah. It was a time of great joy and thanksgiving to God for delivering his people and restoring their place of worship. The miracle of the oil. Jewish tradition also tells of a miracle that happened during the rededication of the temple. When they lit the menorah, they found only enough oil to burn for 1 day. But the menorah stayed lit for 8 days, giving them enough time to prepare more oil. This miracle showed that God was with them and blessed their efforts to honor him. Continuing the fight. Even though the temple was restored, the fight was not over. The Seleucid king sent more armies to try to crush the rebellion. Judas and his men had to continue defending their land and their faith. But now, they were stronger than ever because they knew that God was on their side. In one battle, Judas faced a large army led by Lysias, a powerful general. The odds were against them, but Judas encouraged his men to trust in God. In 1 Maccabees 4:30, Judas prayed, "Blessed art thou, O Savior of Israel, who didst quell the violence of the mighty man by the hand of thy servant David, and gavest the host of strangers into the hands of Jonathan, the son of Saul, and his armor-bearer. With God's help, Judas and his army defeated Lysias' forces. This victory proved once again that God's power was greater than the might of any enemy. Lessons from Chapter 4. Chapter 4 of 1 Maccabees teaches us the importance of faith and perseverance. The Jewish people faced great challenges, but they trusted in God and worked together to restore the temple. Their hard work and dedication were rewarded, and God showed his presence through the miracle of the oil. This chapter also reminds us that worshiping God is worth any sacrifice. The Jews gave up their time, energy, and even their lives to honor God and keep his commandments. Their example inspires us to stay faithful, even in difficult times. Closing thoughts. The rededication of the temple was a turning point for the Jewish people. It showed that God had not abandoned them, and that their faith was stronger than any enemy. The story of Hanukkah reminds us that even in the darkest times, God's light can shine brightly and guide us to victory. Chapter 5. Expanding the fight for freedom. After the victory in Jerusalem and the rededication of the temple, Judas Maccabeus and his followers knew their mission was far from over. While the temple was restored, many Jewish communities in nearby lands were still suffering under the rule of their enemies. These communities needed help, and Judas was determined to rescue them. Helping the Jewish communities. Jewish people living in areas like Gilead, Galilee, and the land of the Philistines faced constant attacks. Many were being forced to abandon their faith or live under harsh conditions. When Judas heard about their struggles, he decided to send help. In 1 Maccabees 5:9, it says, "Then came unto Judas certain men who were wronged by the heathen, and complained, saying, The heathen that are round about us are gathered together to destroy us." Judas acted quickly. He split his army into smaller groups and sent them to different regions to defend the Jewish people. His brothers Simon and Jonathan were sent with armies to specific areas, while Judas himself led another group to Gilead. Each of them had the same mission: protect their people and defeat their enemies. Simon's victory in Galilee. Simon took his army to Galilee, where many Jews were being attacked by the Gentiles. He fought hard battles, showing courage and leadership. In 1 Maccabees 5:23, it says Simon fought many battles with the heathen, and at the last he overcame them. After defeating the enemy, Simon gathered the Jewish people and brought them back to Judea, where they would be safe. Jonathan's success in the south. Jonathan, another of Judas' brothers, led his army to the southern lands. There, he faced strong enemies who had gathered to fight against the Jews. Jonathan's forces fought bravely, trusting in God for victory. After a fierce battle, they defeated the enemy and rescued their people. Like Simon, Jonathan brought the Jewish families back to Judea to protect them. Judas' campaign in Gilead. Judas himself went to Gilead, where the situation was especially dangerous. The Jewish people there were surrounded by enemies and were trapped in fortified cities. Judas led his army from one city to another, fighting and defeating the enemy forces. In 1 Maccabees 5:35, it says, "He took many cities and made great spoils and slew many of the enemies." One of the most important battles in Gilead took place at the city of Ephron. The enemy had blocked the way, making it impossible for Judas and his army to pass through. Judas called on God for help and led his men into battle. They fought with all their strength and overcame the enemy, opening the way to rescue the trapped Jewish people. Defending against new threats. While Judas and his brothers were fighting in other regions, the nations around Judea saw an opportunity to attack. The Edomites, Ammonites, and other groups joined forces to invade Jewish lands. However, Judas and his brothers returned just in time to defend their people. In 1 Maccabees 5:67, it says, "Judas and his brethren went forth and fought against the children of Esau in the land toward the south." The Jewish forces fought bravely and won these battles. They showed their enemies that God was with them and that they would not give up their faith or their freedom. Lessons from Chapter 5. Chapter 5 of 1 Maccabees shows us the importance of helping others in need. Judas and his brothers didn't just focus on their own safety. They risked their lives to protect Jewish communities in other lands. Their actions remind us to stand up for those who are suffering and to trust in God for strength and guidance. This chapter also teaches us the value of teamwork. Judas, Simon, and Jonathan worked together to accomplish their mission. By dividing their forces and trusting one another, they were able to help many people and win important victories. Closing thoughts. The story of chapter 5 reminds us that God calls us to care for others and to stand firm in our faith, even in difficult times. Judas Maccabeus and his brothers showed incredible courage and leadership, and their actions brought hope and freedom to many people. Their story continues to inspire us to trust in God and to fight for what is right. Chapter 6. The Death of Antiochus IV and the Siege of Beth Sur. After Judas Maccabeus and his followers had won many victories, their enemies became more determined to destroy them. At the same time, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the king who had caused so much suffering to the Jews, faced his own troubles. This chapter tells the story of Antiochus' downfall and the continuing fight for freedom. Antiochus' failed campaign in Persia. Antiochus had left his generals to fight Judas while he went to Persia to collect money. He needed funds to pay his soldiers and to rebuild his army after so many defeats. However, his campaign in Persia did not go as planned. In 1 Maccabees 6:1-2, it says, "About that time King Antiochus, traveling through the high countries, heard say that Elymas in the country of Persia was a city greatly renowned for riches, silver, and gold. Antiochus tried to plunder the city, but he failed. The people of Elymas fought back, and Antiochus had to retreat." The illness of Antiochus. As Antiochus returned from Persia, he received terrible news. His armies in Judea were losing, and the Jews had rededicated the temple. This news made him furious, but it also filled him with despair. Shortly after, Antiochus fell gravely ill. The Bible describes his illness in 1 Maccabees 6:8-9. Now when the king heard these words, he was astonished and sore moved. Whereupon he laid him down upon his bed and fell sick for grief, because it had not befallen him as he looked for. Antiochus realized that his plans to destroy the Jewish people had failed. In his final days, he admitted that he had been wrong to defy God. In 1 Maccabees 6:12, he said, "I perceive therefore that for this cause these troubles are come upon me. And behold, I perish through great grief in a strange land." Shortly after, Antiochus died, and his reign of terror came to an end. A new king and a renewed threat. After Antiochus' death, his young son, Antiochus V, became king. Because the boy was too young to rule, a man named Lysias acted as regent. Lysias wanted to continue the war against Judas and the Jews. He gathered a massive army and marched toward Judea to crush the rebellion once and for all. The Siege of Beth Sur. Lysias' first target was the city of Beth Sur. This city was important because it controlled a key route into Judea. The people of Beth Sur were loyal to Judas, and they prepared to defend themselves. Lysias' army surrounded the city and tried to starve the people into surrendering. Judas knew he couldn't let Beth Sur fall. He and his army marched to the city to fight off the attackers. In 1 Maccabees 6:31, it says, "Then they went through Idumea and pitched against Beth Sur, which they assaulted many days, making engines of war. The battle was fierce, and both sides suffered heavy losses. Eventually, Judas' army forced Lysias to retreat, and Beth Sur was saved." The Siege of the Temple. After failing at Beth Sur, Lysias turned his attention to Jerusalem. He led his army to the city and surrounded it, hoping to capture the temple. Judas and his men defended the city with all their strength, but the situation grew desperate. Supplies ran low, and the people began to suffer from hunger. Just when it seemed that all hope was lost, God intervened. News came to Lysias that a rival general was trying to seize power back home. Lysias realized he had to return quickly to protect his position. In 1 Maccabees 6:57, it says, "He hasted to depart and said to the king and to the captains of the host and the men, We decay daily, and our victuals are but small, and the place we lay siege unto is strong. and the affairs of the kingdom lie upon us. A temporary peace. Before leaving, Lysias decided to make peace with the Jews. He offered to let them live according to their own laws and worship God freely if they would stop fighting. Judas and his followers agreed, and the siege ended. For a time, there was peace in the land. Lessons from Chapter 6. Chapter 6 of 1 Maccabees reminds us that God is in control, even when things seem hopeless. Antiochus IV, who had caused so much pain, was brought low by his own pride and defiance of God. His death marked the end of a dark chapter for the Jewish people. This chapter also shows the power of perseverance. Judas and his followers faced overwhelming odds, but they never gave up. Their faith and determination allowed them to save their people and protect their way of life. Closing thoughts. The story of Chapter 6 is one of hope and resilience. It teaches us that no enemy is too great for God and that faith can give us strength in the darkest times. Judas Maccabeus and his people trusted in God, and their courage brought them through even the hardest battles. Chapter 7. The rise of Alcimus and the death of Judas Maccabeus. After the temporary peace in Judea, trouble soon returned. The enemies of the Jewish people were not finished, and a new wave of challenges came upon them. This chapter tells of betrayal, leadership, and sacrifice. The rise of Alcimus. In the time of peace, some Jews began to align themselves with the Gentiles. Among them was a man named Alcimus, who wanted power. He was from the priestly line, but was not faithful to God. Alcimus went to King Demetrius, the new ruler, and offered his loyalty. He also accused Judas Maccabeus and his followers of rebellion. In 1 Maccabees 7:6, it says, "This man Judas and his brethren have slain all thy friends, and driven us out of our own land." King Demetrius listened to Alcimus and appointed him as the high priest of Judea. To support him, Demetrius sent an army led by a man named Bacchides. Together, they planned to crush Judas and his followers. Betrayal and division. When Alcimus arrived in Judea, he tried to gain the trust of the people. At first, some Jews believed he wanted peace. But soon, Alcimus showed his true intentions. In 1 Maccabees 7:16, it says, "So he took of them 80 men, and slew them in one day, according to the words which he wrote." This act of betrayal caused many to turn away from Alcimus and join Judas once again. Alcimus and Bacchides continued their efforts to defeat Judas. They used tricks and lies to divide the Jewish people. Judas knew that the fight for freedom was far from over, and he prepared his army for battle. Nicanor's campaign. King Demetrius sent another general, Nicanor, to deal with Judas. Nicanor was a powerful and arrogant man who hated the Jews. He threatened the priests and even planned to destroy the temple. In 1 Maccabees 7:34, it says, "And he sware in his wrath, saying, Unless Judas and his host be now delivered into my hands, if ever I come again in safety, I will burn up this house." Judas and his army prayed to God for help. They knew that Nicanor's army was larger and better equipped, but they trusted in God's power. In a fierce battle, Judas and his men defeated Nicanor's army. Nicanor himself was killed, and his soldiers fled. This victory brought great joy to the Jewish people, and they celebrated the day as a holiday. The final battle. Although Judas had won many battles, his enemies continued to attack. Bacchides returned with a massive army to fight Judas. This time, Judas' army was outnumbered, and many of his men were afraid. In 1 Maccabees 9:6, it says, "Howbeit, when they saw the multitude of the other army, they were sore afraid. Judas encouraged his men to be brave and trust in God. He said, Let us die in our innocence. Heaven and earth will testify for us that ye put us to death wrongfully." 1 Maccabees 9:10. Judas led his men into battle with courage, but the odds were too great. Judas Maccabeus was killed in the battle, and his death brought great sorrow to his people. The legacy of Judas Maccabeus. Even though Judas died, his courage and faith inspired the Jewish people to continue fighting for their freedom. His leadership had brought hope to his nation and showed them the importance of trusting in God. In 1 Maccabees 9:21, it says, "How is the valiant man fallen that delivered Israel?" Judas' brothers and followers carried on the fight, determined to honor his legacy and protect their faith. Lessons from Chapter 7. Chapter 7 teaches us about the dangers of betrayal and the importance of staying faithful to God. Alcimus and others who sought power over righteousness caused division and pain among their people. But Judas Maccabeus showed us the value of courage and trust in God, even in the face of overwhelming odds. This chapter also reminds us that true leaders fight for their people, not for personal gain. Judas gave his life to protect his nation and his faith, leaving a legacy of hope and determination. Closing thoughts. The story of Chapter 7 is one of sacrifice and resilience. It shows us that even in the darkest times, faith and courage can light the way. Judas Maccabeus' life and actions continue to inspire us to stand up for what is right and to trust in God, no matter the challenges we face.